we have the amazing Amanda King-Hardy, who is the manager of our Reference and Community Services section in the Access and Public Engagement branch. She's a reference service superstar, and I'm very much looking forward to today's presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amanda.
Anna, much appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, for our Halloween Spooktacular. So as Hannah mentioned, my name is Amanda. I'm one of the managers in our reference section here at the Canberra office. Essentially, my team acts as the bridge between our researchers and our collection, helping them navigate. It can sometimes be a little tricky. Today I'll be sharing some stories using records from the National Archives collection, which will give you a bit of an idea of the range of records we hold, but will hopefully leave you with some goosebumps too. Following the presentation, I'll also give a very brief run through of our collection database record search in case you want to go on the hunt for your own gems or spooky things later. And then, as Hannah mentioned, I'm also happy to answer any questions at the end. Feel free to put them in the chat throughout. Nothing worse than saying I'm going to ask that at the end and then finding you've forgotten what you were going to ask. So feel free to pop it in there anytime. I would like to add on a serious note, a disclaimer or a trigger warning as such, that as this is a Halloween webinar, parts of this presentation will have some darker or grim elements to it, including ghost stories and mentions of the untimely deaths of individuals. I think the internet often refers to it as people being unalived. So I would not recommend watching if this is something that you aren't comfortable with. The bulk of that stuff is in the first few stories. It gets a little bit more whimsical after that. I also would not, your call, but I would not recommend this webinar as being particularly suitable for children. So maybe a good excuse to send them out of the room. So with that out of the way, let's dive in. And hopefully I can navigate the tech okay today. All right. So we begin our story, our journey today with the tragic story of Lydia Gow and the South Solitary Lighthouse. So for those not familiar with it, South Solitary Island is a very small island, approximately 18 kilometres off the coast of Coffs Harbour in New South Wales. So the sketches here depict the design of the lighthouse in 1878, with the centre photograph taken shortly after its construction in 1880. With the living quarters built close by. It's my understanding that that's pretty much all that there is on that lighthouse. On that island is the lighthouse and the quarters. Might be a little bit different today. In 1911, a young woman by the name of Lydia Gow, having been raised by her grandparents in Newcastle, moved to South Solitary Island to join her father and the rest of her family, as her father, David Gow, was the head lighthouse keeper at the time. Lydia lived with her family for almost a year on South Solitary Island, as far as we know. However, in November 1912, when Lydia was 17 years old, she and her entire family suddenly became very ill with, now I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but ptomaine poisoning, I believe it is. Essentially what we know today is food poisoning from salmonella. While the rest of the family was able to recover, Lydia unfortunately developed typhoid fever, a deadly infection and common cause of death for that time period. As Lydia's condition worsened, unfortunately, so did the weather, with a severe storm raging around the island at the time of her illness. Her father called for a doctor, however, rough seas and heavy winds delayed the doctor's arrival, and Lydia sadly succumbed to her illness before they could arrive. So with the island engulfed in storm, a rocky terrain not allowing for burial, and her mother unwilling to have her buried at sea, or essentially thrown in, her family made the grim yet resourceful decision to instead create a makeshift tomb, placing her body inside a bathtub with another bathtub soldered on top like a lid. Once the storm was over, the doctor finally arrived, and you can see here a page from the Lighthouse Visitors book in our collection, where those who arrived wrote, "Came with Dr. Wood, but unfortunately too late to be of any assistance to Miss Gow." Lydia's remains were removed from the island, I believe the next day, where her funeral took place a few days later. Now, this would be where you would expect Lydia's sad story to end. However, that wouldn't be very spooky. So While Lydia's body had been taken away and the Gower family never returned to the island, many of those who lived on South Solitary Island in the many decades after her passing believed that Lydia's spirit did not leave the island. Stories from former keepers and their families tell of unexplained footsteps moving around the house, a feeling of constant presence and feeling of being watched, awakening to objects having been rearranged or moved around, and seeing a shadowy figure out of the corner of their eye. In recent years, tour operators have heard movement in the hallways, noticed torches being turned on, objects moved around as well, and perhaps most telling, a historic photograph of Lydia that has hung on the wall for some time has repeatedly been found to have fallen to the floor several metres from where it was hung, so hung back up and found again on the other side of the room. Beautiful scenery or not, I think that if I ever visit South Solitary Island, I will not be going at night. The next stop on our spooky journey is the former Institute of Anatomy in Canberra, which is now home to the National Film and Sound Archive, or the NFSA, as you might hear me refer to it. The Institute of Anatomy was founded in 1931 by Sir Colin Mackenzie, an anatomist and orthopedist who believed that studying the anatomy of animals was vital to medical science and in improving human health. Mackenzie, over the course of his life and career, had accumulated an extensive collection of specimens, and in 1923 he offered it as a gift to the Australian government to form the nucleus, as it were, for a national zoological museum. The museum finished being built in 1930, though it was instead named the Australian Institute of Anatomy, with Sir Mackenzie naturally the first director of the institute. The institute was not simply a museum, but also housed active scientific labs, allowing for dissections and experiments. We can see a few images here of being built and of one of the scientists in the lab. Suffering from low funding in its early years amidst the Great Depression, the Institute quickly expanded its holdings beyond that of the zoological to include ethnographic material, casts, and even human remains. Soon there were jars, cabinets, and many rooms filled with thousands of grim and gory artefacts, including the over 6 kilogram heart of Australian champion horse Farlap, various types of bones, mummified remains, and even body parts from wounded soldiers preserved in formaldehyde, which were donated by the London Royal College of Surgeons. One of the exhibits that went on and off display for many years was the genuine death mask of infamous bushranger and criminal Ned Kelly, which you can see pictured here. For those who aren't aware, because I actually didn't know much about it, but death masks are a plaster cast of the face, and in Kelly's case, it was done hours after his execution. For decades, the death mask rather, sat alongside a human skull that had been found in a prison graveyard in the Institute of Anatomy and was believed to be belonging to Ned Kelly. It was in fact not, which they discovered later once they were able to do DNA testing. It is in fact not Ned Kelly's skull that they had there, but rather Now, you might be thinking, okay, Amanda, that's all a bit grim, but hardly spooky. But over the years, the former institute, now home of the NFSA, has developed a reputation for being one of the most haunted buildings in Australia. Following the death of founder and director Sir Colin Mackenzie, his ashes were placed inside the wall of the lobby with a plaque in Latin. Now, I'm not even going to attempt the Latin, but it translates to, "If you are looking for a monument to me, you are within it." Since then, there have been numerous sightings of the ghostly figure of a well-dressed old man stepping out of the wall where Mackenzie's ashes are stored, looking around before seemingly being sucked back into the wall. In addition to the labs and exhibits housed within the Institute during its 50 years in operation, it was also for a time one of Canberra's first morgues, operating in the basement of the building. A small room in the basement of the now NFSA still has channels carved into the concrete floor, which, and mute now if you don't enjoy gory details, it used to allow for the draining of cadavers that were brought to the morgue. Those who have visited the room or surrounding corridors often report feeling faint or uneasy, experience lights switching on and off, elevators moving without being called, even doors being unlocked. NFSA staff using the former dissection labs have too experienced strange sounds and movements within these rooms. Incidentally, that's actually where they hold a lot of their interviews, so I think it may be a test of character for people who would like to work there to take them to those rooms for their interview. The ghost of a little girl waving through the grate in the old theatre is supposedly a frequent visitor and has been known to distract school children on excursions with her antics. Ghost hunters have even run equipment in the building in the last few years and have detected unexplained movement or shadows. Certainly not hard to see how the building got its name as one of the most haunted. So we can see, if you can see here, there's the plan of the basement and some images of the Institute of Anatomy and when it was built. Okay, so we're now going to move on to something a little bit different. So for the next part of today's webinar, you'll need to pop on your tinfoil hat because it's time for some UFOs. Incidentally, one of my favorite topics in our collection. So records of UFOs are something people wouldn't normally necessarily associate with the National Archives. After all, Commonwealth government records don't exactly conjure images of little green men in most people's mind, more little men in business suits. But the truth is, as a government archive, our collection is incredibly diverse, spanning well over 120 years of history from a multitude of Commonwealth agencies. And when it comes to UFOs, we hold the records of agencies such as the RAF, Department of Air, Weapons Research Establishment, Bureau of Meteorology, and even CSIRO, who are all involved in some way in the receiving, passing on, or investigating reports of unidentified flying objects. The main body responsible for investigation, however, was the Royal Australian Air Force, also known as the RAF. A report from their intelligence area stated that the purpose of the investigation into any UFO is to establish whether or not the subject of the report poses a threat to the security of Australia. And this was a role that was taken very seriously. The RAF received many reports over the years, with hundreds of sizable files in our collection, most dating from the 1950s onwards, perhaps sparked by Roswell in the US. And sightings are often are referred to in the files as first flying saucers, which then later on unidentified flying objects. And then the terminology changed in the 1970s when the government decided to use a somewhat bland term of unusual aerial sightings. We'll now have a look into a few of those sightings. So it was 7:45 in the morning on Monday, the 8th of March, 1971. It was a cloudy day. The faint sound of magpies warbling greeted WA resident Margaret as she opened her front door and looked out at her driveway. One can imagine it took Margaret a moment to comprehend what she was seeing, but it soon became clear. Approximately 40 feet away, on the road near Margaret's mailbox, was a luminescent silver grey object, 6 feet in diameter, hovering approximately 1 foot off the ground, making a quiet whirring noise. Margaret stood, watching the object for around 5 minutes as it quietly hovered there. She couldn't comprehend how it was hovering, not seeing any obvious method of propulsion. But after a few moments, the object suddenly began to move in a southeasterly direction. It was then that a little green homunculus alighted from the object. Margaret was able to get a quick look at the creature before both the creature and the ship sped away. Here you can see Margaret's sketches and an original report of what she saw. So all the details I just mentioned were in the report. However, I have spun a story for them. They're a bit more dry in the report. Margaret's report was received by the RAF on the 30th of April 1974 and was allocated to an officer to investigate. So let's see what they had to say. The officer responded to Margaret around a month later, explaining that because she had submitted her report 3 years after her sighting, there was not much they could do in terms of investigation, aside from check for any similar sightings around the same time, which they could not find. They encouraged that should Margaret ever experience such a sighting again, noting the statistical unlikelihood of this, that it was important she report it just a little sooner. A little homunculus again, any excuse to put it into a slide, really. Our next sighting takes place on the 1972. So it was a Saturday night or early Sunday morning, approximately 1:20 a.m., perfectly clear weather, and Joyce was sitting with a friend on the front porch of her home in WA. Suddenly, their eyes were drawn to a white brightness similar to a bright star across the road and above her neighbour's home. As they looked closer, Joyce and her friend realised that the light was moving and becoming bigger. As it moved closer, she saw what looked like a saucer with a bright light on top, a dark coloured base, and spinning red and orange lights. The object moved slowly behind the tree before coming into view again just above the garage of the home across from hers. The object stopped, hovering above the garage. They watched for approximately 5 minutes, listening to the faint yet constant humming coming from the object as it continued to flash brightly with white, red, and orange lights. Suddenly, the object began to move slowly to the right across the tops of the neighbouring homes, with the two spectators quickly moving down the porch and down the path to see where the object was headed. A few moments later, it suddenly whizzed off and vanished like a flash of lightning. Joyce reported her sighting very quickly, incidentally, including her detailed sketch to the RAF. And after conducting an investigation, the RAF determined a possible explanation for the occurrence. The RAF determined that the most probable cause of the sighting was a phenomenon known as ball lightning. And in their reply to Joyce, they explained that ball lightning was among the most mysterious manifestations of atmospheric electricity. A glowing ball either appears after a cloud to ground lightning flash and remains near the ground, or is first seen in midair, descending from a cloud, or arising from no obvious cause, there remaining aloft until it vanishes. A minority who claim to have seen ball lightning report brightening and colour changes. The colours red, orange, and yellow are most common. The descriptions given by Joyce and her friend are closely identifiable to the American observers' descriptions, and no other normal theory investigated by the team was feasible. I loved that photo so much. Incidentally, I have made it my background in my camera there. Our last UFO sighting takes place on Sunday, the 4th of February at 9:50 p.m. 50 kilometres west of Kimba, SA. Brian, aged 19, who was driving with his passenger, who was dozing at the time, were driving along the highway towards Kimba. With around half an hour left to go on their journey, Brian looked out west when he suddenly noticed a strange light close to the edge of the road. As Brian focused on what he was seeing, he realised that the shaft of light was approximately 10 feet high, 5 foot wide, and a red-orange colour. But that wasn't the strangest part. In the middle of this beam of light, he saw clearly the figure of a man, approximately 6 feet high, dressed in what appeared to be a white modern-day spacesuit and white helmet and mask. And as if a spaceman in the centre of an orange flame wasn't strange enough, he realised the figure was also suspended 2 feet off the ground. He didn't stop, instead continued driving, but he did immediately wake his passenger from her nap to ask if she could see anything. She turned her head to look out the back window and could only see an orange light, but by this time the light was partly obstructed by trees. Brian went straight to the police station once he arrived in Kimba, and the constable took down his report and his drawing and sent it through to the RAF. The constable included in his report that he knew Brian well, that he knew him to be a responsible person, that he wasn't under the influence of any drugs or alcohol, an important thing to check when one sees a floating spaceman, and that he personally went and checked out the area where Brian experienced his sighting shortly afterwards and found nothing, and that he trusted that Brian would not have made the report unless he was sure. So essentially vouching for Brian quite heavily to the RAF so that they would take the sighting seriously. The RAF conducted their investigation over the next few months, and a few months later got back to Constable Summerton with a possible explanation, or rather lack thereof. We regret that the investigating team has been unable to conclusively determine a cause. A possible theoretical cause is that the sighting is a sighting of a phenomenon, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I guarantee it, known as ignis fatuus, Methane gas released from decaying vegetation and spontaneously ignited. But this theory is impossible to substantiate, they said. They also went on to give a few interesting stats to the constable. Of the 653 unusual aerial sightings, so essentially what they were calling UFOs before, reported to the RAF to date, approximately 93% have been logically explained, 6% have had insufficient detail provided to enable determination of the cause, and 1% are unexplainable. For anyone watching, don't go getting any ideas about reporting your own little green men, however, as the RAF stopped investigating sightings in the 1980s. Budget reasons, I think, or perhaps they were overwhelmed with the enthusiasm of their sketches and submissions. Okay, so tinfoil hats can come off now as we move to another one of my favorite areas, and that is our copyright collection. So from musical compositions to short stories, books, theatrical and artistic works, copyright records are a fascinating part of our collection and always a lot of fun to look through. In preparation for this Halloween presentation, I've dug out a few gems for us to look at. So first up, we have a 1924 copyright application, which contained the work, so not all of them do, but this one contained the work, it's from around 100 years ago, by Annie Maria Carson for her literary work, A Ghost Story. The story takes place on the night before Christmas Eve. So I double-checked that twice. It's not the night before Christmas. It's the night before Christmas Eve, with a boy named Tommy who had, for some reason, decided it was a good idea to go wait in the dark of a falling apart bushranger's hut in the middle of the night for the bushranger's ghost that was rumoured to have haunted. Not sure where his parents were at the time. What Tommy got, however, was what can only be described as a sassy, attitude-filled ghost who was instead apparently covering the bushranger's ghost shift. A few lines from the story. Were you disappointed when you saw me here instead of the bushranger's ghost? The ghost asked suddenly. No, indeed, said Tommy. He couldn't help thinking that after all, one ghost is as good or as bad as another. Where is the bushranger's ghost? He asked. It's gone for its holidays, and it asked me to haunt this hut during its absence, the ghost answered calmly. Oh, cried Tommy. Do ghosts take holidays? The ghost raised its eyebrows until they almost disappeared under its cap. Why not? Doesn't the ghost need holidays as well as anyone else? It asked sharply. I don't know, began Tommy. You don't know. Once upon a time, a ghost, just because it was a ghost, was expected to stay in the same place forever and ever. But times have changed. In these days of wireless and aeroplanes, it would be unreasonable to expect any creature to stay in the same place all the time. The ghost who haunts this place and 4 other ghosts have taken a trip to Sydney, and they mean to have a good time too. Now, I haven't had a chance to read the whole story yet because my boss would tell me off if I sat there reading copyright files all day. But one can assume that the speech from that ghost would have put Tommy in his place. Okay, so next we have some artistic copyright works. On the left is a photograph from a 1964 application titled The Ghost of Palm Valley, where we can see, hopefully you can see, the seemingly ghostly figure of a woman standing in a remote region of the Northern Territory. Well, I think we can safely assume this is not a real ghost. The really interesting thing about this photograph, or the thing I find interesting, is it was taken in the early 1960s. There were no computers, no Photoshop. You couldn't simply pop a filter on it, treat the transparency and upload it to Instagram and call it a day. Likely quite a bit of work went into manually manipulating this image to create this unique photograph. And definitely one of my new faves. On the right, now I'm not sure if everyone can see all the images at the moment because my little quickie thing is playing up. Can everybody see? Yes, beautiful. We have a 1929 print as part of the artistic copyright registration for a well-known painting called the Menin Gate at Midnight, or The Ghost of Menin Gate. There we go. Okay, so many of you may have seen this painting before, but for those who haven't or haven't heard of it, it was painted by Will Longstaff in 1927 to commemorate those soldiers with no marked graves on the Western Front during the First World War. The first time you look at the painting, the white markings in the foreground appear to be flowers, or at least that's how they appeared to me when I first looked at it. I'm just going to make sure that's visible there. Can everyone see the enlarged photo of the flowers? I hope so. But the ghostly outlines are good. Thank you, guys. But the ghostly outlines are in fact not flowers, but servicemen marching across the field. So I actually ordered this print over and had a look at it, and it is such a haunting and sobering image, reminding the observer of the lasting impacts of war. And just one of those ones, at first glance, it looks like a really beautiful painting, and then the reality sort of checks in. So next, we're going through the collection. We have some hidden horrors. Why hidden, you may ask? So scary books, movies, and scary television shows are now common in Australia, but this wasn't always the case. From the 1930s, many books that were deemed to be a threat to morality were, for a range of reasons, banned customs from entering Australia. Titles included Tales of Horror, which is pictured here, and I grabbed one of the pages out of it as well, of the thing in the pool. Nightmare by Daylight, Witchcraft, and Tales from the Crypt. Films were also a target of censorship, and in 1948, the Chief Commonwealth Film Censor announced that horror films would be banned in Australia. He stated, "Horror films have no cultural or entertainment value, and its appeal extends only to a very limited section of the community, a section whose mental outlook should not be fed with films of this nature. In addition, such films are a source of potential danger to women in a delicate state of health." Personally, I think that's the scariest thing in my presentation is that last line there, but yeah. Scary movies were banned for a whopping 20 years, and in 1968, due to changing societal attitudes to censorship as a whole, the ban was finally lifted. So we can see here a few articles from our collection. So Exit the Ghouls. I do love that headline. As well as copyright, we also have an extensive collection of patents of inventions. Now, I could have gone for days listing, but I've restrained myself. So here we have pictured two applications. So the one on the left is from 1895 by Archibald Dixon Hunter, titled An Improved Coffin. Reading through the application, there were so many bells and whistles for me to go through today. However, the ultimate goal of the invention seemed to be to preserve the individual for as long as possible and to make it less uncomfortable, I suppose, for those around the coffin in the first few days. The other application on the right, dated 1935 from William Havenhant, features William's invention for improved blades for a scythe. As you can see, the little death in the bottom corner, that is a scythe, also used by farmers, but I prefer to think of it as the one that death carries, because that's super fun. All right, so this next one is a bit of a weird and wonderful one found by my colleague Jeremy, who assisted with some of the research for this presentation. Thank you, Jeremy, if you're watching. And I just had to include it. So this church in Ainsley has an odd history. First built in Rockwood in New South Wales in 1869, it was once a mortuary station used as a terminus for funeral trains that stopped at prearranged stations on the journey from Sydney in order to pick up mourners and coffins. At the mortuary station, the coffins were unloaded for further transport or burial. The building was used until 1938, or as a terminus for funeral trains until 1938, when motor hearses took over the transportation of the deceased. With there being no further need for the rail hearse, the mortuary station ceased to function as it was originally intended. This is where things get interesting. So in 1952, the Railway Department decided to dispose of the building, but it was not until 1959 that a church in Canberra bought the building for £100, I believe, so around $200. I don't know the rough conversion rate. The former military station was then demolished, pulled apart, prepared for transport, and the then 728 tons of stone were carried from Sydney to Canberra in 83 semi-trailer loads to Ainsley, where it was then rebuilt as a church. Now, the last story, I've got one last story before we move on to the record search demo. And this is a haunted tale, which is a bit close to home for our NAA staff. And that is the mystery of the Sanford Street Repository. So for many years, this building, which will look familiar to many of our staff, housed the majority of the ACT-located NAA records. Every day, dedicated staff, including myself at the time, would go into the various rooms to retrieve records requested by our researchers. However, for a number of staff, there was one room that they dreaded to venture into. Many people report that they hated going into one particular repository. When queried as to why, they all gave similar accounts of it just feeling very off or wrong, that they felt the need to leave very quickly. Some said the room always felt significantly colder, despite, as an archival repository, the temperature being strictly controlled. Even recalled seeing the image of a man in a pinstripe suit, which I believe is the point at which I decided I wasn't going to go into that repository anymore. New staff at the time, just in case you think it was just office rumours, so new staff at the time, having no prior knowledge of these rumours, would also return from their first visit to the room quite disconcerted, giving similar accounts to other staff, a general feeling of unease. Now, while most of our ACT-based collection is now housed at our National Archives Preservation Facility, the Sanford Street Repository was renovated and is still used for some of our record storage. Interestingly, following the refurbishment, two staff who had never worked in the former building and never knew of the previous rumours were working in one of the repositories and stated afterwards that they chose to face working each other rather than side by side, as they reported feeling weird energy, as well as noticing the motion-censored lights turning on in a distant area of the repository when no one was working. Both this one and the previous slide about the mortuary station leaves us with the question: do ghosts stay through a renovation, rebuild, or transport? Or perhaps, as per the story we heard earlier, they simply take a holiday. So that's the presentation component of today's webinar. I'll now move on to a brief look at our record search database. And then if anyone has any questions they'd like to put in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them after that. So what you can see here is the main homepage for the National Archives. Along the top, we have our tabs. So we've got Explore the Collection, Help You Go Research, Students, Teachers, Information Management, Visit Us, About Us, and various things. So to get into research, you can either click on the Explore the Collection or hover over the Explore the Collection tab and click on Record Search, or you can get to it directly from the Record Search button on the homepage in the middle there, the blue button. So when you click on that, you'll be taken to this page, which is like UFOs with an S on the end, for example, and then click on Search. This will bring up a list of items that have that keyword in the title. It's important to note that the National Archives collection is not organised like a library. Records are organised not by subject, but rather by the series of items created by government departments, which is why the results you see here are a bit haphazard. They're sort of, we've got an author, we've got what looks like a immigration record and a few other things. It's because that keyword was in the title. Results can be sorted a few different ways from this list by clicking on the headings. So if you wanted to see earliest first, you click on the blue date range. Now, this isn't a live demo, so I can't do it live, but you would click on the blue date range heading, and that would put the earliest records first. And if you clicked on the blue item title heading, that would put them in alphabetical order, and so on. If there is a page or camera symbol under the digitized item heading, that means that the item has already been digitized and it's available to view online. If it's not digitized, that simply means that no one has paid to have that done yet. So things are generally only digitized in response to an order. We also have our advanced search for those who are a little bit more experienced with the database. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, unfortunately, on this today, but as we don't have a lot of time. But as you can see, this lays out the CRS system, which is and the easiest way to remember this is that the agencies or government departments create series or groups of items. And then within those series are the individual items or files. People tend to use the advanced search once they've exhausted their search options in the basic screen. Name search is also a good starting point if you are looking for an individual and can be very useful when you're dealing with a common name like Smith. So you can see here, if you were to put in a surname, you can then choose from the drop down. So things like service records, I'm not sure if copyright and records and the like are in there, but you can choose a category. The downside is that if you are only using name search, if you are selecting particular categories, you can choose all items, but you may miss out on some results. So we normally recommend doing this in addition to a basic search and not necessarily instead of it. Then we can see here is our photo search tab that you can use to search for digitized photographic material in our collection. Where possible, keep your searches broad using keywords. Putting in date range is completely optional, and often depending on the keyword you're using, it's often best to leave the date range blank in your initial searches. So here, for example, I've put in the keyword ghost, and I've hit search. Oops, I think that took me far. My bad. Let's go back again. Goodness, I don't know what's gone wrong there. Hang on. Yeah, we've lost it. Hang on. Yes, there we go. Okay. All right. So can everyone see the images on the right? I hope so. But if basically, yes, lovely. Thank you. So I put in the keyword ghost, hit search. That's given me a range of photographs from old mining ghost towns to government photographers' pictures of ghost crabs. In case you were wondering where your tax dollars were going, it was to take photos of ghost crabs. If anyone wants to know more about how to use record search, as this was a very quick whiz through, we do have some great resources on our website, as well as the help link, which is just above the tabs in record search itself. So if you go into record search and click on help, there is a lot more information there.